From being sewn inside a sack with a monkey and a snake, to being intimately introduced to the effects of molten gold, these are some of the craziest and most brutal punishments in history. Up first is the heretics fork. Humanity really is incredibly creative, sometimes with very ill intentions. During the Spanish Inquisition, a device would be created which not only was viciously effective at instilling pain and regret, but was also almost poetic in its design. Known as the heretics fork, this tool would be strapped to a person's throat, painfully preventing them from speaking or, more importantly, turning their gaze away from God. This was often used for prolonged periods of time to encourage heretics to recant or convert, force them to bend their necks towards the God they deny until they either concede and become the right kind of Christian, or confess and are sentenced to die. Like all forms of, as the CIA would say, enhanced interrogation, this likely didn't actually get many true confessions, as people in pain and desperation will do pretty much anything to survive. The actual use of these tools is disputed. They certainly were used, but whether as an interrogation tool or as a punishment isn't quite clear. Perhaps it might have served as an all-in-one multi-tool, but no matter how you ended up meeting this device, it was never going to have a very happy ending. Now we have the keel haul. This is one of the most famous and well-known punishments throughout history, and stems from the advent of the Age of Sail. In the 16th century, Dutch ships that had to maintain discipline in the rough conditions of the high seas ended up coming up with some pretty horrific ways to punish people. One of these punishments was that of keel hauling, or of hauling someone down the keel. The person would be tied to a rope and dropped onto the front of the moving ship, allowing them to drag across the entire hull of the ship from front to rear. This punishment wasn't meant to be deadly, though it often was. It was meant to be utterly horrific, and that it definitely achieved. But adding these splinters and barnacles on the hull that could cause brutal injuries, and the rushing waters surrounding you that could flood your lungs, and people often lost their lives while being keel-hauled. Some sailors were even keel-hauled repeatedly, though that was incredibly rare. The gridiron. The gridiron hasn't been used often in history, but in times when a king or emperor wants their victim to perish in an exceptionally gruesome manner, the gridiron gets pulled out. Essentially a massive barbecue, the gridiron was most famously used on St. Lawrence before he was canonized. Lawrence refused to give the church's wealth to the emperor, and so was sentenced to the gridiron. However, the thing that made Lawrence the patron saint of comics is that as he was roasting, he turned to the person cooking him and said, "Turn me over because this side is done." It may not be the most outright horrific way to go, since likely the exposed nerves would simply be turned to a crisp, ending the pain very early. However, just the thought of being stuffed in a barbecue for your final moments is completely unsettling. Scaphism. This punishment came from ancient Egypt and is easily one of the very worst punishments to reach this list. The condemned would have their lower body locked into a hollow tree or two canoes so they could not escape. They would then be fed an exclusive diet of honey and milk, which would cause a very upset stomach and all the foul results of that, which would be collected inside the tree they were locked in and festering. They would then be left in the middle of a stagnant pond and left for the flies. It really depends on what sort of a person you are, but personally, I would rather have a crocodile show up 10 minutes in, as opposed to festering for weeks and being slowly devoured by insects and infection. But that's just me personally, maybe you'd rather have more time to reflect. You really just have the lesser of two evils to choose from in this scenario, so choosing the fast way out only seems like the logical approach. It didn't really seem to matter how you went, the executioners just wanted you gone for good. POENA CULLEI. Perhaps one of the strangest punishments in all of history, the reality of this punishment is somehow shrouded by how funny it sounds. This was punishment for the crime of patricide, ending one's father, and involved being sewn into a leather sack with several wild animals, most famously a snake, a rooster, a monkey, and a dog. The sack would then be thrown into the river and forgotten about. There wouldn't be a ton of room for anyone to move around, but the animals would more than likely have a bit more mobility than the human. The animal instinct in this scenario would be to fight for survival, so you can already tell how this one would usually end up. Much like scaphism, it's difficult to tell how I'd rather go, from the panicked mauling and bites of the numerous other animals condemned to the sack with you, or the slow and terrifying suffocation as water slowly seeped into the sack. You couldn't even be left alone with your own thoughts in your final moments, as the animals just continued to attack. Vlad the aptly named. Vlad Dracul was a ruthless and cruel ruler of Wallachia, became so famed and so aptly named because of a punishment he devised for the enemies of his kingdom. He became known as the Impaler for his love of, well, impaling people. Political enemies, the family of political enemies, the diplomats of other nations, entire armies, and prisoners of other nations, and more than a few of his own people, would be hoisted on a sharpened tree trunk and allowed to simply slide down. There were allegedly 4 of these stakes covered in the condemned in varying states of decay. No wonder he got nicknamed Vlad the Impaler. You can pretty much picture how nasty that must have been, but none of these brutal images seem to faze VLAD. There were allegedly forests full of these stakes that were covered in prisoners or anyone who had crossed VLAD himself. Perhaps these terrifying trees served as trophies for VLAD, as he seemingly had no interest in cutting them down or disposing of the waste that was resting on top of them. They definitely would have served as a fair warning to everyone to never make VLAD angry. And the Golden Tongue. Perhaps one of the most iconic and famous punishments of the ancient times, this vindictive measure was undertaken in many cultures over many years. The earliest was likely Crassus, the weakest third of the Roman triumvirate, after he lost the Battle of Carrhae. Allegedly in mockery of his lust for gold and wealth, the Parthians allegedly poured molten gold down his throat. Emperor Valerian was also ended this way. After having tried to bribe his way out of captivity, his captors decided to show him how much they valued his own gold and allowed him to drink his fill. During his expansions throughout Persia, Genghis Khan also allegedly made the lord of a town drink his ransom after the lord offered to surrender for several £100 of gold and silver. While this form of punishment was clearly a way of asserting your absolute dominance, it was also considered a poetic way to punish someone for greed. Those were brutal punishments from ancient history that will definitely freak you out. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. From being sewn inside a sack with a monkey and a snake. In the 16th century, Dutch ships that had to maintain discipline in the rough conditions of the high seas ended up... In the 16th century, Dutch ships that had to maintain discipline in the rough conditions. The earliest was likely Crassus, the weakest third of the Roman It's a new word. The earliest was likely Crassus, the weakest third of the Roman lives while being keel-hauled. Some sailors were even keel-hauled repeatedly, though that is incredibly rare. The gridiron. The gridiron hasn't been used often in history, but in times when a king or emperor wants their victim to perish in an exceptionally gruesome manner, from being sewn inside a sack with a monkey and a snake, to being intimately introduced to the effects of molten gold, these are some of the craziest and most brutal punishments in history. Up first of this type of punishment. It is believed that during his expansions throughout Persia, Genghis Khan made the lord of a town drink his ransom after the lord tried to surrender by offering him heaps of gold. While this form of punishment was clearly a way of asserting your absolute dominance, it was also considered a poetic way to punish someone for greed. And those were the brutal punishments from ancient history that will definitely freak you out. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.